Mitch and I actually met at this agency. So we both started our career at this agency in New York City. And I was chatting with our old colleagues. Do you remember Joe Walsh
I
back in
do
the
remember
day?
Joe. Yeah,
Yeah,
on the
so we
workbridge side. Yeah.
reconnected and I was he was sharing with me about his experience. And I remember, I think like I applied for like a sales job. I think I found something on LinkedIn. It was like a sales associate. And then I
Mm,
got a call from JobSpring and like, oh, it's actually like a sales-esque job, but for a full
yeah.
360 recruiting. They're like, and then they kind of gave me the spiel. They're like, are you interested? I'm like, kind of. Like, I guess that kind of sounds cool.
Do
Was
you
it the
pay
same
money?
situation as you? Like, were you applying for a lot of like random sales roles and you just happened to like click apply now for that?
Yeah, kind of. So, like, I
Mm.
actually applied for a recruiter job. So, in the 2 years between graduating college and moving to New York City, I worked, I did a lot of odd jobs in college, and I've always just done a lot of weird things. Like, whatever helped pay the bills, I did. I've done pest control, I've run gas stations, I worked at a print shop, like all kinds of different stuff. And so, I was always a very like classic Southern, can speak to a wall and have a whole conversation kind of guy. And so when I moved to New York, I was just looking for any job. And my girlfriend at the time was like, very talented graphic designer, found some opportunities very quickly. And I remember we were sitting in our apartment. We had basically enough money to last for 2 months before we just had $0. And so I was desperately trying to find a job. And she was getting calls because she posted her portfolio and her resume on like Indeed and stuff like that. And she was getting calls from these people. And I was like, who is calling you? She's like, I don't know. There's like a recruiter. Like, keep in mind that like we're from South Louisiana. Recruiting is not a thing. I didn't even know it was a job. I didn't know anything about it. And I was like, what do they do? And she's like, they're just talking to me about jobs that they're trying to hire for. And I was like, I could do that. And she's like, yeah, you could probably do that. And so I just went on LinkedIn and literally I saw a couple of recruiter jobs. I just put in my resume. And like I said, I believe Sam King was the first person to call me back. And then I ended up, no, it was actually Sloan. It was Sloan who called me. And then I interviewed with Sam King.
That is
Um,
amazing. So,
yeah.
unlike you, Mitch, I'm from New York, and before JobSpring, which is the name of this agency, I did not know that recruiters existed at all.
Mm.
So, like, I quickly kind of had to dive and just learn about this world very quickly. But I think you just had a little foray and just personal curiosity of your then girlfriend's experience. I think that's super funny. So, for those that are just unfamiliar with the agency world, you alluded to it a little bit before, but what was like do you remember the initial kind of interview and interview process there?
Yeah. I remember it
And
very
just
intimately.
walk hopefully in a good way, maybe in a bad,
Yeah.
we'll see.
Yeah. It's a
But then
nostalgic
we'll,
experience.
it sure is. And then we'd love to just kind of hear about your experience, like the early days and your time at the agency world for those again that are unfamiliar with that.
Yeah. So the interview process was about as like box standard as I've ever seen an interview process before. It was like classic New York, come to an office, we're not going to tell you anything, but you just got to show up, and then you show up and there's a whole bunch of rules you didn't know about. Then you have to go fix them and come back again. So I remember the first time I had to show up and I made the right choice of wearing a dress shirt and dress slacks, because I was like, I've never interviewed for a job that wasn't just like someone's friend or like someone knew something. So I was like, okay, this is like a serious thing. It's a big company. They have their own website, which was like a novelty thing for me at the time. And so I got about as dressed up as I could, right? We're talking like everything from like Gap sort of clearance aisle. And I met with them. I want to say I might have actually interviewed with Joe Walsh, who I know you sort of had on this podcast for. I think I might have actually interviewed with Joe Walsh. And I remember I can't remember the specific questions they asked me. They were mostly just about like, how do I like connect with people? Like, how do I talk to people? Like, how do you go about like structuring your day? Like super like standard sort of like generic questions that you get in any interview. And I remember we ended the interview. We were like ending the interview and they were like, we want you to come back. We want you to meet someone else, but you have to shave. And I remember at the time, like I couldn't even grow facial hair at the time. Like this was a myth in my mind. And I was like, okay. And they were like, how long has it been? I remember them asking me specifically, like, how long has it been since you shaved? And I was like, I don't know, a week. And they're like, you have to shave before you come in. And I was like, I didn't even know I had facial hair. And so I did that. And then I was also told like, hey, try to have a suit jacket next time. And I had to go, I think I went to H&M and bought a suit jacket and came back. And I can't remember how many more interviews I did. I only really remember that first interview because it was sort of like exciting because it was like my first interview at like a big company, but it's also kind of traumatizing. So I was like, I didn't know that there were rules or expectations. I just showed up, but I eventually obviously got the job. And it was surprising to me. Like, this, not everybody knows this. The agency we worked for had two different companies that were essentially the same company, but with two different names. And they would compete against themselves, I assume, to sort of like drive internal competition, drive the market, get more coverage, etc. So I actually interviewed at a company called Workbridge, and then got offered a job at a company called JobSpring, which was very confusing until I obviously learned the interconnectedness of them. I believe they were like a half a block from each other. They were in different offices, different kind of brands. And I remember the offices had also very different feels. The JobSpring had the nice office. We had the good one. We had the balcony and everything. And I remember showing up my first day. I worked under someone I still would consider sort of like one of my origin stories within recruiting as a whole, who also happened to be your boss at JobSpring. That was Devin. Devin was actually the person I was supposed to work for. Devin when I joined JobSpring originally. And that's why I was super excited, because I ended up meeting Devin, and she talked about working in design, talked about all these things. I was like, oh, I have a degree in this. I was super excited. And then I showed up on day one and ended up working for still someone who's very important to my career, named Mike Sarcosta, working in essentially the opposite of design and product management, which was .NET and QA. And no offense to any of my .NET and QA people out there, but it was not the most exciting field to work in. We're talking about technologies that even when I was recruiting for them were fairly outdated. And QA, which is, for better or for worse, often like the lower end of the totem pole in most tech companies. Like a lot of junior level people get their first jobs in QA. And so it was a bit of a shock, because I wasn't working for what I expected. I ended up getting hired by a different company that I wasn't even interviewing for, and had to learn a bunch of things. And that's sort of when I got into this agency space, and it was a lot. I mean, you probably know this. I mean, the expectation at the time, and I know that agencies have evolved a lot in terms of like how they work and how they operate, but when we were doing it, when we were coming up, I feel like we joined that agency space at an interesting sort of cusp period before the more modern approach we see nowadays, and the old school approach that was sort of like built up and sort of I'm losing the word, but like there was a lot of prestige and just like the ability to pick up a phone and make a call happen. And I've always been a very talkative guy, but I'm also a pretty massive introvert. And so the concept of cold calling people, when I found out, I didn't know that the job was cold calling people until like I started doing it. And I remember that being a harrowing experience for me, having to cold call people. And I know there were a lot of people in JobSpring who were just so naturally gifted at it. I know you were one of those people who were just like a savant at least to me, you were a savant on the phone. I just remember you were there a few months prior to me joining, and there was an interesting structure there where to get a promotion, to sort of like accelerate your career there, you had to hit a certain number of deals. I remember it took me 6 months to hit my first deal, which was a long time. It was a long time in that space to get your first deal. Like usually it's your first 2 or 3, you'll look out, your manager will pass you something. And I can't remember specifically why, but it took me forever. But then once I hit them, I started cascading, and I ended up getting to 10 before I left. So I got halfway to where I needed to be. But I think overall the agency experience was one where I learned a lot about partially what recruiting was. That job taught me, you're good at recruiting, you're not good at business development, right? And that was sort of the big lesson that I left JobSpring with. And I'm forever grateful for that experience, because it taught me a really valuable lesson, which is like, hey, sometimes you should just do stuff that you aren't good at to like definitively know that you are not good at this, right? And then, I made my way I started the actual, I would say the real sort of straightforward path into like where I am today, sort of like leaving the agency world. But I always look fondly over like the time that I had there, which was, getting calls, getting deals, getting companies to like let me, who had 3 months of experience, hire their like 10 years of experience engineers, when like I had no idea what any of the words I was saying were, and moved into a space where I actually got to start getting a little bit more intimate with the candidates, which was the side of the things that I was always much better at, which was good at building relationships, not good at building business relationships.
What kind of sparked you to leave? Was it really your just complete hatred towards business development? You're like, I never want to do it ever again? Or, at that time, you're like, what? I do like certain aspects of recruiting, and this is something that I can really just embrace and see myself doing this aspect of recruiting for the rest of my career. And so what was kind of your thought process, and why did you end up going to in-house?
Yeah, it was an interesting time for me, right? Because I feel like around the time that I ended up leaving the agency space, it was also around the time where I really started to like find my place in New York, right? Like, because you have to keep in mind that when I started doing this job, I had only ever lived in like the biggest city I'd ever lived in had like a population of like 200,000, right? Like, and I grew up in the backwoods, like literally the backwoods. I had farms on 3 sides of my house, right? And so New York was a crazy experience for me, both as a sort of a working opportunity, working at JobSpring, but also just like trying to find myself. And I think around the time where I started having thoughts of like, I should maybe look to do something else, was around the time where I started actually feeling comfortable in New York, right? Like JobSpring was kind of a safety net. I have a lot of friends there. There was a lot of social activities around JobSpring, and it was like, felt very good. And I feel like around the time where I started looking for a job was around the time when I realized like, hey, I don't actually hang out with the JobSpring folks as much as I used to, right? I started having my own friend groups and things like that. And so I think a lot of it, if I had that earlier, there's probably a good chance I would have left earlier. But a lot of it was the closest thing to a home that I had at the time. It was the closest thing to a safety net that I had. And it's not like I was there for the money. Agency recruiting, especially entry level, is not the most lucrative field. It becomes a much more sort of lucrative sort of opportunity down the line, but getting started, it wasn't. And so, the main callus was there is that I started to find my mojo, if you will, within sort of the New York space. And the other side of it was I was very into a gaming community at the time. I did a lot of setting up gaming meetups, LAN parties, those kinds of things. And I remember VR at the time was sort of like up and coming. And I had taken a couple of phone calls. I remember I talked to like people at Jet and a couple of other places back in the day, even like early Riot. I was just not experienced enough to really make it at a company like that. And I found this opportunity at a very small team. There were 10 people, and they just needed somebody that knew just a little bit more about hiring than they could. And I just sort of jumped on it. Right. It was a big pay increase for me. And I remember what sealed my overall impression of JobSpring was when I accepted the offer and I went in, and I remember I was terrified. I was so terrified to tell my team. I was so terrified to tell Sloan, the gentleman who ran our office and the New York City division, that I was leaving, because they were, like I said, they were the closest thing to a family that I had in New York at the time. And I remember telling everybody what I was going to do. It was like, I'm going to go lead recruiting. I'm going to go be the recruiter for this very small VR startup. And everyone was just so happy for me. And it was a weird experience, because I was expecting everybody to be upset or sort of judgmental or any of these things, all the thoughts you have when you're be quitting, you're leaving your first job. It's super natural. But when I met them and I told them like, I'm going to go work in VR, that makes so much sense. We're so happy for you. Like, I'm sad to see you go, but like, this makes so much sense. And that gesture was sort of like what really solidified the thinking I now have, which is like what JobSpring did for me at that point in my career, and sort of helped me understand a lot about why I made the decision I did and when I made it. So it really didn't have too much to do with any sort of like specific feelings, because I think by the time I was about a year and a half in, I was kind of numb to a lot of the feelings I had the first 6 months in. I had finally found my groove, but a lot of it had to do with how long it actually took me to do it. And by then it was really just like, I wanted to do something that I was better at. And I wanted to do something that was more in line with the things that I liked doing, which is the people aspects and the candidate connections and those things, and not so much the sales. I respect the hell out of people who can do that, because I can't still to this day. So yeah.
So what was your day-to-day like at in-house, and what was, I guess, the biggest difference aside from the sales aspect working at like a startup in-house versus obviously an agency like JobSpring?
I mean, the biggest transition point for me, and I maybe have a bit of a different experience, but I think everyone's experience is a little bit different. I left a very structured environment where there were very clear expectations. There were very clear numbers and deliverables and things you had to hit. And I joined a team where I was the only recruiter. My CEO was younger than me. The founders were the other founder was the same age as me. Right. And it was an interesting experience, because I had to take a lot of what I learned from JobSpring and bring it into an agency world where we both know it's not a one-to-one translation, right? It's a very different in-game. There's a very different process of how things go. But I took a lot of what I learned from guiding my candidates through other people's interview processes, through other people's sort of approaches. And I took a lot of the things that I learned from the agency space in sort of having this outside-in view of other companies. And I sort of like patchworked together things that I liked to start building out a process, right? And I think the day-to-day there was different every single day. And I think that was the hardest part, was that at JobSpring or at the agency, everything was the same. Pretty much every day, every Monday was going to be the same as last Monday. Tuesday is going to be the same as last Tuesday. Friday is going to be the same as last Friday. We're going to do everything we can to get a half day, that kind of stuff, right? And I came in the agency side, especially for, we were pre Series A. We were like in between seed and Series A when I joined this company. Every day was different, and not every day was just recruiting. Some days were trying to source an ATS system, because our applicant tracking system at the time was our CEO's email and like kind of Indeed. and like kind of monster, and sort of like having to find that. And then also like having to work with our CEO on like a pitch deck because he needed certain different sort of opinions on these spaces, having to learn about payroll because I was the closest thing that our team had to an HR person at the time. We did have an HR person, but they were in India. And like, it's just, it was, and I think that is where I started to become who I am today. And it's sort of where a lot of seeds were planted sort of for a lot of things that are I'm starting to realize are blossoming from the things that I learned back then. And I think it's hard to talk about what the day-to-day was because the day-to-day was so different. And I did that for 2 years and it got better and it got more structured, and I ended up hiring a recruiter to work for me. I became the manager there, which is crazy because I had 2 years of experience, and I the biggest transition was I did a lot more of what I wanted to do, but I also got to do a lot of things that I didn't realize I wanted to do. It's where I started opening doors of like, I like process. I like the creative aspect. I got started to like be able to tap into the things that I sort of walked away from when I decided I didn't want to pursue anything in the degree that I sort of went to school for. And so I can't give you a straight answer because every day was a little bit different. I can give you a straight answer about like what my day looks like now because it was a lot more structured. But then I think it was the juxtaposition. It was the chaos from the structure that sort of built a foundation for me. Like, so those two experiences hand in hand are a lot of what sort of created the person I am today. So
for someone that wants to hopefully work at a Chronosphere-like company, right?
Yeah.
Maybe they're at a company right now and they're just not happy. Or maybe they're looking to kind of start their in-house recruiting career at a tech company. If you were them and you were to kind of go back in time, like what sort of maybe questions or things would you really look out for when it comes to interviewing and selecting companies that you want to interview for to kind of maximize the chance of finding a company like Chronosphere?
So a company like Chronosphere exists not because of what we do or what we built or the success we have in sales or how much we pay or anything like that. All of those things exist because of the mentality of the people who both started the company, run the company, and sustain the company, right? Has nothing to do with our industry. It has nothing to do with our business, right? There could be a company just like Chronosphere in, I don't know, the CMS space for marketing, right? Like that could absolutely exist, right? And what I always tell people is don't get too focused on what a company does. You should care genuinely because you should want to do what they do. But I didn't join Chronosphere because I love observability, which by the way, that's what we do. We're an observability tech company. I didn't even know what observability was. I joined the company because I had a really good friend here and I had a very honest and very blunt conversation with her about the fact that I was hurt. I was scarred. I was jaded and I was mad about the experiences that I'd had in recruiting over the pandemic and even before that. And I was just asking the blunt questions of like, are you going to respect me? Right. And maybe don't ask it that bluntly. I had a good friend that I could be very blunt with in that moment, but you need to figure out, is this company going to respect my time? Think about how they talk to you in emails. Think about how they approach you in the interview process. Think about how they answer the questions that you ask, right? When you ask about culture, are they just saying what's in the job description and what's on their career page, or are they giving you a genuine answer, right? If they're not giving you a genuine answer, why aren't they giving you a genuine answer? Do they not know? Or are they trying to hide the fact that it's not so good? So don't only ask about things like culture or work-life balance or work-life harmony, however you want to approach it, or about comp, or about all of these very important underlying factors of a job. Don't only ask about them one time, and don't only ask the recruiter. Ask everybody that you interview. Take some time in every interview that you do or every sort of interaction you have with the company you're starting to approach, and ask about these things and form an opinion. And I always tell people this, like, don't take my opinion on culture. I'm going to give you an incredibly biased, incredibly personal take on why I like this company. Take that and ask someone else the same question and build up your response, build up your answer, come to your own conclusion, because it's just, we have a good company. And I would love anybody who wants to work at a company that sort of respects them to come and take a look at Chronosphere. Maybe we'll be compelling you. Maybe we'll have something that lines up. Odds are maybe not. We have some very specific expectations, but give it a shot. But there are companies out there that exist like Chronosphere. And I would say that a lot of them are probably not as well known. There's a lot of companies that say they're the best place to work and are in fact the opposite. And something that everybody should know this, the top 20 places to work in the world or whatever, these lists that come out every single year, that's pay to play. The companies that are on that paid to be on that. Not saying they're bad companies to work for, not saying they're not good companies, but I'm saying you have to keep in mind that a lot of these things are pay to play and you need to do your own research. Don't just trust Glassdoor. Don't just trust the opinion of the recruiter. Don't just trust the opinion of this article from Built In or wherever who said that this company is the best place to work for in New York City, whatever. Build your own opinions, do your own research, talk to people, whether you're seeing bad things in Glassdoor or good things in Glassdoor. I've worked for amazing companies that had really bad Glassdoors, and I've worked for really bad companies that had really good Glassdoors, right? So it's a combination of facts. And I wish I could give a quick tip, but the reality of the situation is there's a lot of tears. There's a lot of angry nights and a lot of very upsetting situations that I had to go through to get to this point. And I had to learn it the hard way. And I hope that me telling you, do your research and don't take that opinion seriously, or don't take a single person's opinion seriously. I hope you take that lesson seriously because it took me a long time to get to that point. Right.
I particularly love the fact that, you know, you're encouraging people just to make an opinion, but to ask a lot of questions, not just to one, but to get multiple perspectives, because depending on your situation, you might be desperate for a job. So first offer comes, you accept it, right? But depending on your situation, it's also important to kind of take some time, reflect, do some deep thinking on what you really like, what you really don't like, and just collect data by asking as many questions to as many people as possible, and just not rushing and only focusing on the basics like comp and work-life balance and all these buzzwords that,
and those things are important.
They
right?
are.
I want to highlight that, right? Like if you need a job, right? What I'm saying is still important because you want to know, hey, I'm going to take this job, but I know that there's some things off here. So I need to be careful about this area, or I need to be sort of conscious of this thing. And it applies to both sides, whether that be finding a good company or just finding a job and knowing what you're getting yourself into, you know?